Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome to today's Parasoft broadcast. We'll be talking today about codifying cyber defense in DevSecOps to reduce cyber attacks. And we have a couple of great speakers today. I'm Arthur Hicken. I'll be your moderator today. If you have questions, suggestions, let us know in the panel. We have with us Amy DeMartine, who's Vice President and Research Director at Forrester, who does all kinds of cool security stuff, and will be benefiting from that skill and experience that she has. And Kevin Green, who's recently joined Parasoft as Director of Security Solutions. Kevin comes from MITRE and before that DHS, and has spent a lot of time helping the country and the industry grow as a whole with security. So we look forward to hearing that. So with that, I believe we will start with you, Amy, and let me change it and let you share your slides.
All right, so now we're going to go off webcam. All right.
Yes.
Then. All right. Oh, that's weird.
We see your creator slide, not your. There you go.
You good? You don't see this go to webinar box, right?
Nope.
Okay, good. Oh, phew. All right. All right, so should I just go anytime?
Yes.
Thanks for having me today. So today we want to talk about DevSecOps, and we can't really talk about DevSecOps without first talking about the developer teams we're trying to support. And what we've seen in the past few years is that their speed has increased dramatically. And it's really because they've embraced things like DevOps, a lot of automation in their development processes. What they're really trying to do is get their ideas and creativity out to customers. And what we've seen here at Forrester is for those companies that are customer obsessed, moving faster usually wins. So getting those ideas, those new features out to customers is really key to winning the hearts and minds of not only current customers, but potential customers as well. So when we look at this in 2018, 27% of developers said that they could release applications monthly or more frequently, whereas in 2020, that number jumped to 41. Now you kind of see it slowing down between 2019 and 2020. And that's because there's, only a certain number of teams are embracing it inside of companies. So there's not a whole lot of growth that can happen, from 41% of applications moving monthly or faster. If you think about your own firm, you might think, well, that's a lot of our applications that would be moving to that fast. If 41% of them did, we also have legacy applications. We also have applications that haven't moved to this more automated kind of release cycle. It may be more waterfall, for example. So when you think about 41%, that's a lot of applications that are moving at this kind of speed.
Amy, quick question for you. Since we're moving so fast with developing software, do you think we are creating vulnerabilities at a faster pace? And if so, how do we tame the beast that has been unleashed?
Yeah, there's definitely a fear that, well, if there's junk coming in, there's junk coming out. So if we're really not doing application security well, all we're doing is actually generating more applications with even more security flaws in them. And that might certainly be the case. However, what we really should be looking at this and thinking is this is our moment for security pros to insert security testing early and often, almost behind the scenes. So developers don't really know that we are running a bunch of security tests. They get stopped in particular moments in their software delivery lifecycle to say, hey, you need to look at this or you need to fix this. You know, when I was developing code, we let developers know right at the end of their software delivery lifecycle, oh, here's this whole list of things you have to fix. Well, then we became a hurdle that you have to get over to release. And if it's in the moment, so developers are already thinking, they're already in that headspace of, I am developing this piece of code, whether it be a weakness, oh, I've got SQL injection flaw here, or there's a particular open source component that they're including that might have a known vulnerability with it. They're in that headspace, so fixing it is a lot easier. And if we can use their tools, then this is our moment, this is our time to shine and say, okay, we can actually help you move faster and become even almost a fifth gear in a car where you're like, hey, we can actually make you move faster. So it's not just the 41% that are releasing monthly or more frequently. Security can be a boost to it, and we can get even more applications to release faster. Application security is still the biggest issue with breaches today. So when we asked in our latest surveys, we do these huge surveys, we do one specifically for security, we say, okay, have you suffered a breach? And then we go that one click down and we say, okay, if you've suffered a breach, how did it happen? Now, multiple choices are allowed. So if it started out with phishing, for example, and moved on to something else, those responses get marked. So the respondents can choose multiple. But of the 31% of firms that suffered a breach, how it was carried out, number one this year was web application flaws. So think SQL injection, cross-site scripting, those kinds of things. Those are number one. Now, number four came in as software vulnerabilities. Now, this is the first time in several years where web application and software vulnerability did not come in as number one and number two. And usually what they do is they just flop between years. Sometimes it's vulnerabilities that are number one. Sometimes it's the web application flaws that are number one. But this time, in the year of COVID, what happened was, assets went home. And that became one of the top attack vectors. And then, of course, malware made a huge resurgence this past year. So this year, we've got web applications as number one, and then software vulnerabilities as number four. As things start to settle down, as people return to offices, as we figure out how to better secure the assets that our employees are using, I expect it to go back to the way it has been, where we've got web application and software vulnerabilities as number one and number two, simply because we have not seen a huge jump in the expertise around application security.
Yeah, that's interesting, Amy, because the number one that's on your list is SQL injection with web applications. We've seen SQL injection be on the OWASP top 10 for over a decade. And I think at this point, all of our jobs should be to remove it from the top 10 for the new release that's coming out. And in doing so, I think that would be progress for me.
Absolutely. That would be an amazing amount of progress, just because simply, first of all, like you said, it's been around for forever, but it's a well-known attack vector. If somebody's going to get in, this is a well-known exploitation. So if we could get rid of just SQL injection, that would be an amazing boost to application security as a whole. So part of the security survey that we do, we also ask, what are your top tactical information or IT security priorities over the next 12 months? And we were pleasantly surprised this year that application security actually bubbled to the top. So for years, we have talked about the fact that application security was the biggest weakness. It was almost like we were rolling out the red carpet to attackers saying, here, this is where you should attack applications. And we weren't doing much about it. It still hadn't bubbled up to the top of priorities, and it is finally bubbled to the top, and we could not be more excited to see this movement. The next one, of course, is improving threat intelligence capabilities. That's great, and application security can be part of that. Where you're doing protection technologies, for example, you are increasing your intelligence capabilities. And then also made the top 10, build security into the development process. So that's also a great thing to see that leaders are really committing to, we've got to fix this application security problem that we've got. Okay, so now I've given you the good news. Yay, application security is a priority. The bad news is I want to talk about the distance that we have between number one of improving application security capabilities and services and the build security into the development process. So when you think about DevSecOps, today you think about, okay, we're going to build in security testing into the software delivery lifecycle. And like I said, this is our moment. This is our time to shine. We can take advantage of all of this automation and put in security testing so that developers are almost blind to it. They don't have a very friction-full kind of experience with security that we've had in the past. It can be very frictionless. But if you see, okay, we are going to improve application security capabilities and services, great, but then building security in the development processes is not right next to it. How are we going to improve application security without putting it into the development processes? We firmly believe that this is the best way and almost the only way to get developers to pay enough attention to application security to really make a dent in the number of flaws that we have out there. So let's look at specific tooling to see where we are in terms of planning to adopt and adopting. So this is for SAST, so Static Application Security Testing. And how you look at this graphic is the dark green is that where people are planning to adopt in the software delivery lifecycle, and the light green is they are adopting. So it's already been implemented. And you'll see here that in the testing, that's where most people have already adopted. 40% of folks said we have already implemented SAST in our testing phase of our software delivery lifecycle. I'm not real excited about the 34% that have implemented it in production. That means it's too late to catch it before it's out into the wilds of production where both customers and malicious attackers can both get at your applications. So we really need to see that decreasing. Now, it's great that only 22% are planning to adopt in that. We'd love to see zero. We don't. We see 22%, but that's okay. We do need to start seeing this march to the left. Like I said, the earlier that you can get to developers and notify them, the better. They're in the right headspace. They're in the right moment to fix problems, including security quality problems. So we are seeing planning to adopt 46% in development, so that's great news. So we do start to see a spike at development. It's very hard to put SAST, earlier than that into the design phase. So development is a perfect spot for SAST. And, we hope to see it in later phases of development, like testing, for example, possibly as a final run. So development, maybe you're running SAST only on the code that they're working on in the moment. So maybe just the file and or collection of files that they're working on. And then when you run it again in testing, what you're doing is you're doing a complete look at an entire set of code and running it across all the different pieces, parts, so that you can see the different code flows. You can actually assess, as this file or this part of the code talks to this other part of the code, are we still security flaw free? Software composition analysis is the tool that really looks for vulnerabilities in open source components. So whereas static application security testing really looks at your proprietary code, what we see in modern development is that the open source component is becoming a larger and larger piece of applications, including legacy applications. So it used to be that really the modern applications, the one that were implemented in just the last few years, we saw 80 to 90% of that code being open source. Now we're seeing legacy applications adopt more and more open source as they go. So we're going to start to see more and more vulnerabilities. In fact, when we looked at the data last year about, what is the biggest attack vector, number one was vulnerabilities. So we think that this is going to be and continue to be a sore spot for applications is vulnerabilities. So what do we see here in terms of planning to adopt and adopting? Once again, not real excited about the adopting in production, because once again, it's a little too late. It's walked out the door. It's good to do it because we should know what's out there, but it's definitely too late. Malicious attackers have already gotten to it, especially if there's known vulnerabilities, because if it's already been disclosed, there's enough information for a malicious attacker to build the right tools, code to come and attack your code, to attack your applications. Now, we do see a spike in development, which is great. We do see that it's 41%. We also see that the adoption in development and testing is pretty high, also good things. So we do see a shift to development. It can actually go even earlier, depending on your definition of design. If you implement things like checkers inside of browsers so that as developers are browsing and trying to pick new open source components as part of the design phase, then you can actually start implementing SAA even earlier than you can implement something like a static application security testing tool. So good to see the design is a little bit higher than SAST. That's what we expect. And it's good to see that things are marching towards more development phases, probably not moving fast enough, probably not moving fast enough out of testing, where truly developers have totally forgotten why they've included a certain open source component and will have to start from scratch to try to fix it. So this brings up the question, are you really testing as early as you possibly can? So let's talk about where these tools can fit inside of the software delivery lifecycle. And what I've got is these little diamond shapes that are, these little golden kind of diamond shapes. Those are points where you can stop the software delivery lifecycle, even when it's automated. So you can insert automated tooling quality gates to say, okay, if it doesn't pass here, I'm going to stop the developer so that they can fix their code and then move on to the next phase. Now, we talked about software composition analysis, SCA, and SAST being the ones that can move earliest in the software delivery lifecycle. In fact, SCA, if you put those checkers into browsers, they can move even in the design phase. Static really needs code to already have been written. It's really hard to push it before design, but it's one of the earliest ones that you can do. Now, a lot of times when we talk to clients, they tell us, we're going to input this right after a check-in. So once a developer has checked in code, then we're going to run the static testing. But the other thing we're seeing is a major push to let's just put it in the developer tools themselves, so into something like an IDE. So as a developer is writing their code, that tooling is running, the static tooling is running in the background and then can highlight almost like a spelling checker, oop, you've got an issue here or an issue there. Now, like I mentioned, the problem with that is usually you're going to be only looking at the set of files the developer is editing at that moment. And so you will have to add another gate later in the software delivery lifecycle to get a full picture of the entire application code. Now, one of the two tools that I did not mention is dynamic application security testing, or DAST. That actually needs running code, so that can't be run until much later. However, with the push to do more automated testing, the great thing is, hey, I've already created an environment on the fly. I've already loaded my application. I'm already doing automated testing. Adding in the DAST test is much easier than it has been in the past, where a security pro would actually have to spin up an environment and actually do the testing themselves. Now, the IaaS tools, these tools are sort of a hybrid between SAST and DAST. What we've seen is in cases where customers have adopted this, they are actually able to put it right at when somebody's doing something like a functional test. So they've spun up their own private environment, and at that point you can run IaaS. So it can be run pretty early in the software delivery lifecycle. DaaS we see more at the, hey, we're going to do a big test right before we release. So when we approach application security testing, one of the things that we have not been good at is threat modeling. We haven't really sat down as security pros and thought, how is this tool meant, or this application meant to be used by our end users? We don't really think about what the application is for, who it's targeted at, how it's supposed to be used. But going forward, it's something that application security folks will have to start thinking about. How can it be used, and how can it be misused? And how can we prevent those misuse cases, especially from happening? So one of the things I wanted to mention here was the Ring doorbell. We highlighted the Ring doorbell several years ago because we thought, hey, here's something that application security people are probably not thinking about is the Ring doorbell. People are probably thinking, you put the Ring doorbell outside, and one of the misuse cases that we highlighted was, well, now you can start to see who's around. Does the data that the Ring doorbell is collecting, could it be used for other purposes? Things like neighborhood watches, and or could it be used in divorce cases, for example? What we did not predict a few years ago was putting a Ring doorbell in a child's bedroom. And that's something that we should all be thinking about, is where can these tools be implemented that we weren't quite thinking of at the beginning, and how could we prevent its misuse? We did not dream of it being put in a child's bedroom. We did not dream of the fact that a hacker could get a hold of it and actually threaten kids in their own room. So it's something that we all in application security need to start thinking about, is how do we get involved at the design phase? How do we understand what this product does and use our brains? Because developers are thinking about their creativity and how it gets out. They're not thinking about how malicious attackers are going to use something. That's really for us in security to do. It's really for us to sit down and think, okay, but what if we put it here? Or what if it was used in this other case? How could we prevent it? And how could we help developers design better applications for these use cases? The other thing we need to start thinking about, and it's not just about open source, it's also about third-party dependencies. Today, third-party dependencies are big, and they're only going to get bigger. So this is part of another one of our big surveys. This one is priority in journeys. We asked, business influencers, okay, what are you using? Are you developing it all yourself? Are you pulling in third-party components? Are you pulling in third-party data? And the answer is 72% say they incorporate third-party resources in key technology areas. So that's tools, that's code, that's data that your firm is using from an unknown source or from a third-party source. Now that third party also has third party, so that's where you get into the unknown sources of, well, I know my third party, but do I know my fourth party? Do I know my fifth party? Do I really know where this tool has originated? So there's some key steps that application security pros need to start thinking about now in terms of addressing third party, fourth, fifth, all of that risk in the software. The first thing is, of course, we all need to get an accurate inventory of our third-party relationships. And once again, it's tools, it's data, it's not just our open source, although we can't drop the ball on open source. We need to keep going with understanding open source and the vulnerabilities there, like you saw, still in the top 10 list of issues, and we expect it to rise again. So don't drop the ball on open source, but at the same time, we have to take a closer look at our third-party relationships. The next thing is we can't just limit it to third party because there's an unknown factor there once we start digging deeper into the different levels. Now, I'm not saying you should go to the nth level of your third parties, but you should go down at least to fourth and fifth. Start to try to understand where these tools are originating from, where the data is originating from, where your software is originating from. If you're using, for example, third-party software and you're just including an entire package, maybe for reporting, for example, you need to understand where it's coming from. And then not only should you be making an accurate software bill of materials, but you also need to understand these third-party providers and get their software bill of materials so that you really start to understand what the scope is of your exposure for third parties. So for SCA, taking back a step, what can it really do for us? Not only does it analyze for vulnerabilities in our open source, it creates a software bill of material, but it can also reduce our license risk. So these third parties can often contain licenses that our legal teams would cringe at, and in fact would say, no, you can't use those. So we also need to use software composition analysis to reduce the license risk. It also, in some cases, and depending on the tool, can analyze commercial components. So components that are frequently used and included so that we know if those components have been identified as having vulnerabilities. So one thing that application security pros leave on the table, they don't include or even think about in terms of, hey, we could be using this data to help our developers. And that's the data that comes from our own application security protection tools. So yes, they are absolutely there to provide protection. So let's take a moment and think about WAF. WAF has been around for a long time. Required by some of the, like PCI DSS requires WAF, at least to have it, be present in front of all applications. Okay, so it's providing a level of defense, but it's also giving us something that we don't normally think about, and that's threat intelligence. We actually have at our fingertips exactly what attackers are doing to our applications, how they are trying to get in. And even if we are thwarting those attacks with our WAF, we can take that data back to developers. First of all, it'll be very eye-opening for them to actually see that there are active attacks happening all the time. They aren't aware of that. Remember, they are trying to get their creativity to customers. They aren't thinking like an attacker. They aren't thinking that their application is currently being attacked either. So that data is most important to them. But also where in the application is being attacked. And that can be helpful to prioritize their security flaws that they're trying to fix. Usually when we run scanning tools, we find a flood of results. And developers almost think, why even start? We're doomed to fail. We've got so many flaws out here. We don't even know where to start. What's most important? Now, of course, we can prioritize for them because of severity of a flaw. But we can also say, paired up with the protection technology information, we can actually say, okay, this part of the code is what's being actively attacked. Let's try to fix those first because we already know that we have a threat in this space. I also want to talk about integrity. It's one of the things, just like the use cases and misuse cases, integrity is a looming threat. And maybe it doesn't feel like a clear and present danger like third parties do with open source or even with misuse cases, but integrity is looming, and it's something that we all need to start thinking about now. And that is, what happens if what we have isn't what we quite thought it was? So for example, we already know that there have been integrity issues in tools. So what you have, you need to make sure that what you have built is what you've tested, is what you've released. So that you know that if something gets mucked with after it's been released, you are able to reestablish. You know that it's happened, and you're able to reestablish the right code base. So that we already know is a problem. But when you start to think about these very automated software delivery lifecycle pipelines, you start to think about the tools that can pump out code. So when you think about tools like Jenkins, or you think about Kubernetes, key parts of our software delivery lifecycle, these can also be vulnerable. And like Kevin was alluding to earlier, if we start pumping out junk with these tools, suddenly we can start doing a lot of harm very quickly. And we've already seen flaws that have been exploited in things like Jenkins and Kubernetes. So it's very important that we understand the integrity of our tools, the integrity of not only just who's able to get into them, the identity and access management of them, but are they the right tools? Have they been mucked with in any way? The other thing we have to think about is data. Now, there's a ton of data that your firm collects. There's the data that you're using, third-party data, data that you're generating, data on data, data for your business processes. All of this data, especially if it's used for decision-making inside of an application, can be mucked with. And if that data is, then what you're generating is not good at the end. And it could be done for embarrassment. It could be done maliciously to try to get into or to create to try to get into your customers' data, for example. So it's really important that application security pros start to think about integrity of our own software, integrity of our tools, and integrity of our data. And with that, I'll pass it on to Kevin.
Thank you, Amy. Wow, you provided a wealth of information and data that I think is important for us to at least attempt to codify that into how we deliver software. And a good place for that is obviously DevSecOps, right? Codifying cyber defense in DevSecOps to reduce cyber attacks. I remember a presentation that I saw, which was hosted by Microsoft and one of my colleagues in industry, David Molnar at Microsoft. And in some ways, it talks about, it was a security researcher on, and they was talking about how a security researcher was able to find specific bugs in different competitions. And one of the things he alluded to was that he leveraged his intuition to find bugs, right? So you see that there was a $225,000 award that he had for hacking a popular browsers. And the security researchers asked, how do you find bugs? And he said, my intuition led me to discover these type of bugs. And I think it's important for us to really leverage our intuition. Our intuition is like a reasoning system. We are the next generation reasoning system. Our intuition should be able to guide us and help us better understand how we should develop, build, and deploy software. One of the things I think is important to understand over the years, there's so many things that we learn about breaking software, building software, and fixing software. The question becomes, how do we power our reasoning systems, right? The things that we know, how do we power our reasoning system with our intuition so that it can guide us to finding things and being able to understand how software is working, being able to figure out how to maneuver like an adversary. For instance, if I was an adversary, this is how I would go about breaking or exploiting this or that. This leads to better cyber defenses, being able to think like an adversary and use our common knowledge and our intuition that we've acquired over our professional careers in breaking and fixing and building software. Amy, you alluded to some very good information about things that are possible things that we leave on the table that is chock full of valuable information for us, right? There's a lot of goodness. There's a lot of crumbs we leave on the table that can be used to inform software development activities. For instance, there's a ton of application security telemetry, attack data, penetration testing information, hunting knowledge that we can codify and use it in building better software? How do we consume this data to be able to codify our DevSecOps pipeline with a threat context? And I think it's important to have that threat context because it allows us to pivot and maneuver faster. It allows us to better understand ways in which we're being attacked and how we need to set up defenses, how we need to do software development to be proactive as opposed to being reactive. We must use this data, obviously, in our intuition. And the reason why we need to do it, we need to push left, right? There's so much stuff we learn about how we build software, break software, fix software, that we need to push this all the way left. All the way left. Amy, you talked about threat modeling. Threat modeling is a phenomenal activity that every software development organization should partake in, right? And it happens before we even start developing code. And I think it's important to do that. When I said push left, right, we need to push this threat context all the way left into the design phase and have the entire product team understand about ways in which software can be misused and abused. Developers need to be able to understand the consequences of their daily coding, refactoring activities on exposing vulnerabilities in software. So if we can do that, I think we'd be able to codify things, right, and be able to do more preventive side things up front, so that organizations who want to move fast and accelerate through software development so that it can deliver at speed, they're able to do that. Why? Because we're gaining momentum. We're building and preventing things from going wrong early in the software development lifecycle. So we don't have to break builds constantly trying to fix things that were not detected. Obviously, having this threat context and codifying this inside of a DevSecOps toolchain is very important. Why? Because that telemetry can help provide deeper test coverage and risk coverage about things that could go wrong, things that will go wrong, in terms of how adversaries are trying to attack us, right? We talked about having a ton of information from web application firewalls and being able to use that feedback loop, that continuous learning loop, and all the way back to developers so that they can understand, you know what, here's the consequences of my coding and refactoring activities on doing this. And I need to be aware of this. I recently spoke to a developer, a former developer of Walmart. He's no longer there. And I asked, I said, what does it mean to a developer to build security in? And he said a couple things, right? But one of the things that he wanted to, he alluded to me was the fact that there's so much things that a developer has to worry about. And they don't, and there's so much friction between the folks who run the application security testing tools and development organization. And partly because there's so much data. What do we do with all this data? Having the right context and threat context allows the developers to understand. And I think part of it is we have to help them understand so they can do their job better, so that it can take an active part in security. We want to be able to push security left. Not saying we want developers to make it their primary job, but I think everyone has a role in security, and we need to be able to have that buy-in. We need to have that collaboration. We need to have that partnership in building better software. Recently, there was not recently, but in 2017, I believe, Recorded Future provided some threat intelligence about things that they were observing with the Chinese vulnerability database, right? And they noticed that there were certain CVEs that were being altered to correspond with offensive campaigns that were being launched, right? One of the things I noticed is that the CVE at the time, the Chinese vulnerability database, was a lot faster in publishing, producing, I should say, CVEs. So there was a 33 days to 13 days, right? The time it takes to publish CVEs. That's enough time for malicious actors, adversaries to go in, alter vulnerability data. One of the things I do is I recommend that everyone go and pull down this data set. And in the data set, you will find some really, really good information. things about web application attacks, things about patching information. And the goal was to try to leverage this information to confuse and deceive people about patching, right? This allowed them to monitor the rate in which patching was done. Why is this important? Why? Because we use a bunch of software, open source software, right? You know, people are always pulling out components and frameworks in their projects to build software. So being able to have this information and push it right to developers, so when they go and look for different components and frameworks to use, to have some understanding of things that are likely threats or possible threats to stay away from, being able to do a gap analysis and assessment, this can inform software component selections. We can monitor SBOM artifacts by understanding, okay, here's all the ingredients that are used to build my software. We notice some threat information that we receive from this source or that source. We're using this in our software projects. We need to build some monitoring capabilities around these artifacts. Also, this allows us to expand testing coverage. If we know that there are things that are being altered, there's threat information around specific CVEs or specific exploits that are in the wild, we can then increase our test coverage, or at least provide some test coverage for that. Attack surface analysis. There's so many things that we build today that are everywhere, right? So being able to have a way to understand what parts of the application are being exposed is important. The SolarWinds, that took everyone by a storm. And I think one of the things we have to do as an industry and who as an industry looking to be proactive in how we go about delivering software, we have to learn from our past. And part of that is, and here's we're talking about being able to codify cyber defense and DevSecOps. One of the things we have to do is learn from our past and be able to deconstruct and codify specific attacks and specific breaches that have occurred, where there's common knowledge that's being shared by different intel resources like FireEye and CrowdStrike, and being able to hone that information to better understand things that could go wrong. Leveraging MITRE ATT&CK, for an example, to be able to understand tactics, you know, what was the adversary trying to achieve, and the different techniques and sub-techniques they were used to carry out their mission. Right? It's important to do that. Why? We need to be able to extract lessons learned to be able to codify this into software development practices. For instance, we need to know the ingredients in our software, right? And be able to use things like automated analysis around SBOM. We need to vet our suppliers. We're talking about ways in which we need to have visibility to kind of prevent some of these SolarWinds type attacks that have occurred, right? We need to vet our suppliers. Are our suppliers using SDLC, software development lifecycle practices, and are they enforcing this in policies? Are they enforcing this as part of their software development practices? We need to be able to validate software integrity. Amy, you brought that up, how software integrity is so important. All right, we need to be able to leverage tools, different testing techniques to be able to validate the integrity. Where did the software come from? Like, who's the fourth and fifth and third supplier? Like, where did the software come from? Does it have any backdoors? Does it have any malicious, whether intentional or unintentional software embedded in it that can be malicious? We need to, you know, do a better job in integrity of software. The time to mitigate is important. Threat intelligence, bug hunting, all this is important because we do know that the time to exploit is shrinking every day, and we need to do a better job on the back end on patching and remediation. But if we have awareness and leverage threat intelligence to understand and being proactive in terms of understanding risk to our software, I think we've been in a better position. And the other thing is secure delivery process and being able to have artifacts to validate and verify whatever you're getting is actually wasn't manipulated, wasn't altered or any shape, form. So I want to wrap up in summary, right? And I think this is great information that we discussed, but in summary, you know, we need to be able to use threat context to calibrate our DevSecOps tools, right? And being able to give context to tools, right? Right now, tools don't have any context, right? They scan, they point and click, they scan. We need to be able to codify this in a DevSecOps pipeline so that we can provide better context. so that we can pivot and move and improve the developer's workflow and triage so they can focus on things that matters the most, and they're not chasing a bunch of things that are somewhat irrelevant but doesn't have a likely threat associated with it. We need to be able to do that. We need to be able to use this information to identify gaps in test coverage. What additional things that we need to test for that we're not testing for? What additional testing techniques do we need to incorporate into our overall tool chain that we're using as part of DevSecOps? This allows us to prioritize mitigations, like as I mentioned, focus on the things that matters the most, and leverage threat models to improve testing, right? I believe that threat modeling can be used as an engine to guide more efficient and effective testing to problematic areas and hotspots in software. Also, in summary, next slide. Also, we need to be able to understand what could go wrong and the consequences, right? Using threat context to help developers understand what could go wrong. The goal is to incorporate these things in developers' daily activity. So they are more educated, they're aware, they can do defensive programming, they're aware of things that could go wrong in their coding and refactoring activities. I think that's highly important to understand that. It's not that developers don't care, they just need to understand. And I think the more information we can provide with a continuous feedback loop, I think the better we are. We'll be able to reduce some of the friction that exists. Be able to employ defensive programming for prevention. Prevention is one of the things that we don't necessarily focus on. A lot of times we focus on detection, and we fail to realize the benefit, the value in prevention, right? Being able to do things early up front, right? Before the software moves from the developer's desktop, or even before then, when the software is being developed. So anytime there's new features or functionality that need to be onboarded to an application environment, everybody on the entire team is thinking about ways in which this functionality and these features can be misused and abused. It's very important to do that. And also, it informs decision-making in supply chain. What types of software, libraries, components I need to stay away from, or which components that if I do use, I know that I need, it's a high maintenance component. I need to do a lot of things to maintain patching and maintain software around, maintain maintenance around this. Having some idea of that is very important, because you don't want to bring a software component or use third-party components or libraries that have a ton of vulnerabilities associated with it. It means you're constantly patching. And it prevents developers from working on new features or functionalities. And we already know developers want to be able to use the innovation to help deliver software. So I think this is finally it. I think this has been a great conversation, Amy, about things that we need to do, right? And things that we can leverage with the things that we have in our current operational environment, in being able to codify cyber defense in DevSecOps to reduce cyber attacks. So I think we have some questions, I think, that came in about different things that we talked about today. Are there some questions?
Yeah, we have a few questions, and some of them are actually kind of grouped together. So I'll go through them in order that hopefully makes some sense. And afterward, if you guys have a quick summary, I'll give you a minute or so to get your little final say in. So one of the questions that came up, and Kevin, you had mentioned this, I think, early on, can we really remove SQL injection from the OWASP top 10? And if so, how? Either one of you can answer.
You could go first, Amy.
Yeah, I think it's going to take a concerted effort. The tools will highlight the SQL injection flaws, and what firms could do is prioritize. Those are the flaws we are going to try to get rid of. They could be part of the CIO's goal or the CISO's goal of, hey, we will get rid of these flaws and we'll do it in a certain time frame.
And I think design is a important part of it. And I think a lot of times what happens over time, I think organizations accumulate so much technical debt. There's things that they can't pay down in time. And I think SQL injection is one of those things, right? And we have to go back and figure out, what parts of the application we need to maybe redesign, or what components we need to use that may be may have a more friendlier defect and attack proneness rate. so we're not constantly being exposed to SQL injection vulnerabilities.
Yeah. So the next question is, if I do push my security testing left, do developers really care about security?
I don't think
and no. So, developers have a lot on their minds. They are trying to balance what features can get in what time frame, how to implement them, what's the best use case for the end user of their product or service. So they're trying to balance a lot. Is security top of their mind? No. However, they do worry about the quality of their software, and security is just another software flaw. It's just another software quality issue. So they do care about it, but they aren't thinking in terms of daily attacks. They're not thinking about threats. They're not thinking about how a malicious attacker could take their code, their creativity, and use it against the firm. That's not what they're thinking about daily, and really why we almost have to make our security controls hidden from them. It just needs to be part of the way they do daily business.
And I think coding standards is an important way to kind of do that and kind of integrate that as part of developers' daily activities. I think one of the things we do have to understand is, as you mentioned, Amy, developers, there's so much pressure on the developers. I think the more appropriate question needs to be asked is, do we care about developers? One of the things I want to do, I want to be a developer advocate. And I think a lot of times, a lot of gets dumped on developer. And I think rightfully, unfairly, and I think a lot of gets dumped on developers. We have to have a way to have them understand, as you mentioned, Amy, the consequences of their daily, their coding, refactoring activities, but also we have to provide better training and awareness to empower them. Not saying that security would be their main responsibility, but we have to have buy-in where they feel like, that people care about not only the work that they're doing, but also they care about how they go about doing their daily jobs and being able to assist them. And the sooner we can have better understanding of that from the AppSec side and interacting with developers, I think we can, help remove some of that friction, get the developers care a little bit more about the work that they're doing and why security is very important.
Yeah, and Kevin, I think there's like a perfect follow-up question here around that, and both of you touched on this during your thing, but does the SAST activity belong in the IDE or the pipeline or both?
So my opinion is it belongs in both. The earlier you can catch it while developers are in their headspace and developing code, the better. So you absolutely should put it in the IDE. Is it going to catch everything? No, it's not going to catch the complex interactions that a specific developer's piece of code has with the rest of the code base. So you absolutely have to have it later in the software delivery lifecycle as well.
I agree. I think it needs to be both, but I'm going to say that pairing that with some form of threat modeling makes it a little bit more powerful because we can be more pinpoint in terms of what we are looking for and how we can discover specific issues that can expose vulnerabilities in software. So I do think it belongs both places, but also I think we need to pair it with threat modeling and other testing techniques to improve the efficiency of static analysis.
Yeah, thanks. So we have a couple of questions around integrity and suppliers, which I think both kind of hit the same thing. One of them was like, how important is this integrity threat? Is this something that I have to worry about today or next year or the year after?
I think it's something that everybody needs to start thinking about right now. And you don't have to be extensive. You can start off small. At the very least, start with, even if it's just checksum that you're using, start by making sure that what you build and what you test is what you release, and make sure that what you release stays what you released. So even if it's using something as simple as checksum, make sure that you've at least got the integrity of your applications, and then you can kind of expand from there.
Yeah, I want to add on to that. I think the other thing is, we need to be able to have some assurance and vet our suppliers, right? Because now what we're seeing is, an adversary may not go directly to attack a company per se, but they may go through a supplier to attack several companies, right? Several high-profile customers. So I think it's important to really, date your supplier, understand their software security practices, how they deliver software, how they maintain, what do they do to maintain and reduce the cost to maintain software. I think all those things are important to really understanding the integrity piece. And to add what Amy has said, all these other things are important in terms of being to have some verification around software and what's in software. All those things are important as well.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting because Amy was focusing here on what you're using, and you're focusing on where you're getting it, who you're using. And the next question was really about vetting suppliers, which is, do we need something like TUV for security so that people have some kind of a rating and we know they're doing the right thing?
My short answer is absolutely. Kevin, do you have a longer answer?
No, 100%. I think one of the things we do know from different studies in the industry, there are common software security practices that mature organizations, software development organizations do religiously. The more we understand what those things are, I think the better we are in selecting the right supplier.
And I had a personal bonus question around this one, just because of your imagery, Amy. I was trying to decide which was more dangerous, the parakeet with the tiger head or the tiger with the parakeet head.
I think the parakeet with the tiger head. I don't think you're ever going to think that's coming.
See, but I thought that the parakeet was tiny with a tiny tiger head, whereas a full-size tiger body with a full-size parakeet head's maybe scary. And
now, if it was full-size, yes, but if it's a little-size parakeet, so I immediately went to a little teeny parakeet head on a huge lion, in which case I don't care.
Yeah, so your picture was ambiguous. So, the context matters, like Kevin always says.
Agreed.
So one final question that came up, and I think it's a perfect one to end on. What are the most important actions I can take right now to help improve application security?
The biggest step I would like to recommend is to prioritize. I talked about the flood of results that can happen when you start scanning. And even if you've scanned for many years, you're still going to get a flood of results, and it's going to be really hard for developers to know what to attack first. So whether that's prioritizing simply based on severity, so be it. If you can get even more complex with your prioritization and use things like threat modeling to prioritize, all the better. Make sure you are telling your developers what they really should be working on first.
For me, it's a lot of times, and I asked Amy early on, I think a lot of times we can move so fast in our software delivery process. So one of the things I think is important for organizations to really understand is the cadence in which you want to deliver software to support your mission. Because sometimes moving too fast, we are creating vulnerabilities at a faster pace. And a lot of times we do know we're not patching fast enough. A lot of things that are happening is because we're not patching, we're not remediating fast enough. So we really got to get a grip on really understanding the cadence in which our organization needs to develop software that's in line with the mission, right? The mission needs to achieve certain things. So having that understanding is important because everyone can't deliver at the same pace. Some organizations have real mature software processes and they automate a whole lot of things. Everyone just starting out. So know where you're starting out in terms of DevSecOps or DevOps, I should say. Understand your journey so you know you're doing it right and you're not creating more work in the long term.
Well, I'd like to thank you both for joining us today. This has been a really excellent session, and we have a few things on the screen here, places you can go to learn more about security. And I'd like to give you just a quick moment to Amy for a closing statement, if you will.
Yeah, application security is not a lost cause. We should not be throwing in the hat and saying, no, it's too much. We can't do anything about this. We have focus of security leaders that, yes, indeed, application security is important and top of their list. Now is our time to shine. Now is our time to really make improvements in our application security.
Thanks, Amy. And Kevin, your closing statement?
Don't just shift left, push left, because I think there's powerful threat context that can be built into the software development process to be aware of things that could go wrong and will go wrong to improve our cyber defenses.
So thank you again, both of you. We appreciate you being here with us today, and the rest of you, we look forward to seeing you again in the future, and stay safe out there.